Is our program for the week of September 8th, 2025. Um, Political violence is accelerating in the colonies and the metropole at an astonishing rate. Just this morning, Israeli attacks killed 59 in Gaza on the heels of attacks yesterday against an UNRWA school and shelter in Gaza City. Here in the US, the headlines have been filled not only with uncertain reports on the details of far-right activist Charlie Kirk's assassination, but inflammatory rhetoric from Trump and his MAGA operatives blaming the quote radical left for not only the attack itself, but the political rhetoric that created the conditions for this violence. Not to mention the absolutely incomprehensible revisionism and cowardice from liberals like Ezra Klein, who seem unable to condemn the violence without rehabilitating the image of someone whose rhetoric was steeped in racism, xenophobia, and violent musings about what should happen to communities and political forces that he opposed. On the same day those events transpired, CP launched the first session in our Fighting Fascism series with Rachel Herzing and Robin D.G. Kelly. I hope some of you had a chance to check it out, and if not, the recording is on YouTube. It was, to say the least, a bit of a solve for all the intense take-making and reactions of the day that are, in fact, still ongoing. And Kirk's assassination took place amidst other school shootings and against the backdrop of escalating political violence that has been taking place across this country for the last few years, especially. Rachel and Robin made the point during their discussion that people's understanding of what constitutes fascism is often relative to how long they've been, as Rachel put it, swimming in the boiling water. And that is to say, political violence has been happening, and they spoke about how college campuses and the reaction to the Biden and Trump administrations to political activity, namely the Palestine Solidarity movement on college campuses, exemplified the way in which liberals have, in no small part, set the stage for the broader problem that think piece after think piece will somehow manage to forget has reached colleges and universities and the streets of the United States over the past several years as we have been organizing against the genocide. I wanted to just play a short clip from that conversation that I think was timely and relevant.
I'm interested in two things here. I'm interested, one, in your take on kind of the reaction of universities, including your own employer, if that's appropriate for you to talk about. I don't know
Part
what
of it,
your
like the
what your
dog.
thing is with that, but like the reaction of universities to what I think is incredibly inspiring and very, very successful set of mobilizations, coordinated actions, sustained coordinated actions. Um, and also what you think, the role for a university is in a period of fascism. We have examples from Greek universities, for instance, being no-go zones for military, for law enforcement to kind of push back there and create sanctuary. There are many different kinds of things that people have done from the location of the university, but I'm wondering about what you think is possible right now. You recently were talking about the obligation of intellectuals in this period, so I'm curious about that too.
Right, right. Well, I'll give the short version, but the longer version you can see in Boston Review, the most recent issue, you can get online. The responsibility of intellectuals in the age of fascism and genocide is the piece. Um, so I I can't say I was about to say I go back and forth, but not really. Let me begin by just saying that you're actually right that in many cases the universities have succeeded in putting down these the campus protests. They certainly succeeded in crushing the encampment movement without the help of Trump. And this is, I think, the most important thing. It was under the Biden era and under the Democrats, as well as the Republicans, of course, but there was a bipartisan war on these students whose demands were so, they were just limited. I mean, limited in a beautiful way, meaning that they said, look, we want a ceasefire. We don't want genocide. We want our universities to divest. They're not even calling for a revolution. And yet the repression they experienced was unlike anything that we experienced in the 80s during the anti-apartheid movement. It was like there was nothing like what we saw, especially not just especially, but I saw with my own eyes on this campus. Um, and why is that? That is because uh, the universities in the US, unlike some of the European universities that may be more state funded, that don't rely on donors, big capital, hedge funds, um, trustees who run things, they handed the university to the Trump administration. They were working behind the scenes before Trump was elected to ensure compliance, you know? And so it didn't surprise us that Columbia would capitulate, that Harvard, no matter what they say, if you pay attention, capitulated to the Trump administration. They have this kind of false narrative because of this lawsuit that the AAUP uh, uh, put forward, but Harvard was already, you know, agreeing to some things they should have never agreed to. But they were doing that before. They were doing that again, under the Biden administration. So this is all consistent.
Samar, just a lot going on. I want to ask you to react to all of that. I think we got a lot to cover today, but certainly, we're, now facing kind of escalations on and es acceleration on all fronts. We started this PSA, we were talking about the urgency of some of the action here locally, congressionally, and or legislatively rather. A lot going on, a lot to situate ourselves to. I think it's nice to have these moments when some of our comrades can kind of give us a bigger picture perspective and help us think calmly about how to parse through it all. But I'm grateful that we have this space to be able to really ground folks in an understanding of, this is not separate and apart from what's going on here in the United States, as we've said so often in the PSA, that very much the fight against fascism, central to that is this fight for the end of the genocide in Gaza and, of course, for a free Palestine. So glad to have you back. I know you've got a lot going on later today, so I'll hand the floor off to you and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Thomas, and thanks for that clip. Like you said, the two of them in particular, like such a salve in moments like this. I find myself thinking about Robin Kelly's comments at the Haymarket Conference at least once a week, and like the centrality of the ways in which the fight against fascism really just permeates all these different, hyper local all the way to the global struggles, and that the only way to defeat it, like as this like many-headed hydra. You can't just like knock out one piece and hope that the other pieces go away. Like it has to be this kind of multi-directional assault. Um, and it's good grounding, right? Because it also gives us a sense of what's possible, that we can accomplish the things that we can accomplish here in our own backyard actually have these sort of ripple effects and have these big impacts on what's happening globally. So yeah, we are very much in the thick of that today, these local
My
struggles. So
goodness. Yeah.
I am gonna, we have a bit of a condensed set of things today. I'm gonna try to do it as quickly as possible because we got to get back to some of the other stuff. So we will do the main takeaways though. So just the quick overview of what's been happening over the past couple of weeks. As folks know, the strikes in Gaza that Israel has been unleashing both by air and by shelling have been really bad these past couple of weeks. The official death toll has gone up by about 1,700 since our last PSA, which was 2 weeks ago. So we're still seeing something around that rate of almost 1,000 people being killed every single week. Just astonishing, like brain-breaking numbers that it's sometimes really hard to internalize. In the context of that, of course, the focus lately has been on Gaza City, where the IDF is gearing up for this massive demolition campaign to take over and basically completely demolish Gaza City. And so we're starting to see the beginnings of that. We've been talking about this for weeks now, those of you who have been attending regularly. The IDF has been putting out evacuation notices just a couple of days ago, they've now ordered the full evacuation of all of Gaza City, despite the fact that people really have nowhere to go. Like there are no other places for them to evacuate to, given that, the one so-called humanitarian zone is completely bereft of necessary humanitarian supplies. So like there's no shelter for people to go to in areas like that, but also those areas aren't safe and they're constantly being bombarded as well. And so what we're seeing from a lot of people is actually the decision to stay in Gaza City, or, as reported in the Times and a few other places, people trying to evacuate from Gaza City, looking for somewhere else to go, realizing that there are no other options and coming back. And that's, particularly devastating because these people are just trying to survive, right? And Israel is doing everything it can to make that impossible. The most high profile aspect of this that we've seen, this week and a little bit of last week is the demolition of these high-rise towers, which are some of the only remaining large-scale residential structures left in all of Gaza. And the IDF has been systematically targeting and bombing these high-rise structures. They've destroyed at least 3 so far, including a relatively famous tower that was housing the Palestinian civil society organizations working with the United Nations and working with the ICC on its warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant. So no real surprise there that ended up being directly targeted by the Israelis. But of course, right, like this idea of destroying this infrastructure is meant to sort of push people out. And all of this, by the way, is the prelude to the thing that they're actually meaning to do, which is this larger scale invasion of Gaza City, which has not actually really begun. There's been a few troop movements here and there in the peripheries. But again, because the IDF is constantly terrified of actually being on the ground anywhere, they're just trying to bomb their way into security for the soldiers who will be taking over the city. And even that isn't really working. 4 soldiers were killed just a few days ago in Gaza City. So this sort of thing continues to happen despite their attempts to soften the ground for their coming invasion, which we don't really know when that's coming, but is likely to be, I would say, not this coming week, but maybe the one after it. But who knows, right? Could be sooner, could be later, could never happen, could be tomorrow. But the extent of the catastrophe of the full invasion and destruction of Gaza City is really hard to overstate. We're talking about the further displacement of hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of people, again, who have literally nowhere to go and no infrastructure to support them if they go anywhere else. So, given the amount of global outrage that this campaign is causing, there is a window here for doing something. Whether or not, sufficient pressure can be brought to bear is a little bit hard to say in this moment, but I'm feeling more optimistic than I have in a while, actually, that that kind of pressure is building towards something, even though we feel like we're not seeing it yet. That's often the way these things sort of work is, you push, nothing happens, and then all of a sudden the dam breaks. I feel like we're getting closer to a dam breaking, but that might just be because I'm extrapolating from what's happening in California. But yeah, there's a lot to say about what's happening in Gaza, and we'll loop back around at the end. The other big news, of course, is around the ceasefire proposal that wasn't. Folks may have seen last week, Trump, supposedly Trump, but very likely the Israelis, using Trump as an intermediary, sent a new, and you can see here in Dropsite, the word proposal is put in quotes, sent a proposal to Hamas, basically outlining what would be the terms for the end of the conflict. And the fact that it is a 100-word document just speaks to how unbelievably vague this ceasefire so-called proposal was. There was actually only a single concrete deliverable in the entire document. And that deliverable is the immediate release of every single political prisoner that Hamas is still holding. And then everything else, the number of political prisoners that Israel is holding that would be exchanged for that, the withdrawal of Israeli forces, the reopening of other humanitarian corridors, all of that is sort of vaguely referenced and described in a sort of like, oh, well, Israel will commit to exploring blah, 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 just a nonsense proposal. That really seems very obviously not designed to have elicited an acceptance from Hamas. Like, it's so vague and so pointless that, like, basically everyone knew, and I'm 100% sure that even Trump and whatever, the Israeli negotiators were well aware that there's no way that Hamas could accept a deal like that, that forced them to give their only leverage away in exchange for basically nothing at all. And so, if you had asked me last week, I probably would have told you this proposal is designed specifically for Hamas to say no, so that Israel can continue their assault on Gaza City and say, like, hey, look, like, we tried, it's on them, like this very common Zionist talking point of like, oh, they turned down every peace deal that's offered to them, right? It's another one of those, this poison pill that absolutely can't be swallowed. And that way, when Hamas invariably rejects or asks for amendments on that deal, the Israelis and the US can say, look, we tried to get a ceasefire, we just failed to do it. A kind of thin pretense at this point, obviously, given that the whole world is seeing what's happening, but a pretense nonetheless. That's what I would have said last week. This week, the answer has become a lot more clear and a lot more macabre, which is that the ceasefire proposal, again, in the exact same way that Trump did with the Iranians, was designed to get Hamas leadership, and to be clear, Hamas political leadership, not their military leadership, their political leadership, in one room to discuss the things so that they could be attacked and bombed by the Israelis, right? Just this craven attempt to assassinate the negotiating party of the ceasefire negotiations on what is supposed to be neutral ground, right? This like third party mediator facilitated space where Hamas is supposed to be able to operate. Now, it's really hard to overstate the implications of this, and in a weird way, it may not mean much at all. Like, obviously the escalatory nature of this is deeply troubling. It was one thing for Israel to be bombing, Iran and Lebanon and Syria whenever it wanted. Those are all enemies of the United States. But Qatar is an ally of the United States, right? They work very, very closely together. US military bases are in Qatar all over the place. And so the idea that now the Israelis, with US backing, obviously, because despite the fact that the Trump administration has changed its tune maybe 4 or 5 times now about what happened in Qatar, it's very, very clear that they were apprised of what was happening before it happened. There's an open question about whether Qatar knew or not, but we'll come back to that. But the fact that the US and Israel will sign off on attacking anyone, literally anyone, does not matter how close you are to the United States, does not matter how much you've cozied up, does not matter how much you've bent over backwards to appease them, you can still be bombed into oblivion just because they want to attack you like this. Like, this is the logical consequence of the erosion of any sort of so-called rules-based order or, international law, whatever it may be. This is where we get, right? Might makes right. So people can do whatever they want. So that obviously hugely troubling. Also, for those of us who held out any hope that a ceasefire would be signed, this is also troubling because for all intents and purposes, this is the end, right? It's the end of the ceasefire negotiations. Because under what circumstances would the Hamas political leadership go to any mediated process ever again, if the expectation is that when they show up, they're going to be murdered, right? And by the way, all of this for having accomplished nothing. The Israelis managed to kill 6 people, but none of them were, in fact, the senior Hamas political leadership that they were targeting. One was a Qatari security official. There were a couple of bodyguards. The funerals were held yesterday, I believe, or today. So I think we have a pretty accurate picture of like who was killed. And so did not accomplish anything that it meant to do, but just ended up sparking this like massive backlash of global condemnation and anger. Whether that global condemnation can accomplish anything is, again, like we're living in this new moment where none of these rules really matter anymore. And Israel is at the forefront of tearing all of these rules up. Nevertheless, I think we'll see some really fascinating things happen here as it relates, to Qatar and their role as a mediator in this process generally. They seem to have pulled out of that process altogether. They've issued some pretty harsh statements to the point where I do think it's conceivable that they, in fact, did not know about this ahead of time. Trump has claimed that the Qatari government did know, and the Qataris responded by saying, yes, we were informed that there would be a strike, and we were informed about 10 minutes after the strike occurred, which I believe that. But who knows? You know, they could also be complicit in this whole thing. It's really hard to say. And it's worth like taking a step back just for a second to reflect on the fact that, you know, the justification that Israel used for this, you know, totally beyond the pale attack here is that, you know, Qatar is like harboring Hamas officials. But it's really important to remember, you know, like you know, Trump and the Israelis and others are trying to sort of paint Qatar as this like, you know, playing all sides kind of player in the game that like is really cozy with Hamas and is trying to protect them or whatever, and like that really could not be further from the truth. And in fact, the reason that Hamas is in Qatar at all is because the U.S. asked for it, right? Like this was and this is not like some sort of weird conspiracy theory. This is openly public information. This was back in the Obama administration, but still, when Hamas was kicked out of Syria, the US government requested that Qatar take them in so that there would be this sort of like space where, you know, it's useful to have this sort of intermediary space where they can engage with a political group that they can't directly communicate with. And that's now gone too, obviously. So again, really hard to overstate the damage here. And, you know, for all that this is the death of the ceasefire process, like the ceasefire process has obviously been dead for a really long time now, and we've known that, right? And we've been talking on the PSAs for ages now about how there's no interest by Israel of signing any sort of ceasefire agreement. So, you know, this sort of just puts that down, I think, for good. Over in the West Bank, some interesting things going on with like Israel moving forward with and backtracking on annexation plans. I don't want to put too much stock in this backs off talk of annexing the West Bank idea as if the United Arab Emirates has any real pull over Israel or is willing to use any leverage on Israel. They don't and they won't. Because at the same time that, you know, Israel is putting out these statements saying like, oh yeah, we'll take that seriously, sorry. Netanyahu is saying explicitly this week that there will never be a Palestinian state, and you know, signing off on the West Bank its settlement expansion plan that we discussed in the last PSA in E1 basically cuts off all the main pieces of the West Bank from each other, and Netanyahu's describing that specifically as the death of a Palestinian state. So not much to see in terms of the hand waving about whether or not the annexation is formal yet or not at the end of the day. Israel is continuing at a very rapid pace with the de facto annexation of the West Bank, which I think will follow with a de jure annexation sometime not very long from now. By the way, the other West Bank news that I didn't have time to add to the slides that I just saw yesterday was the mass arrests and detainments that are happening in Tulkarem, which if folks didn't see, like it's just an absolutely horrifying dystopian sight of hundreds and hundreds of people all lined up being marched out of their village by all of these armed goons. It's just a terrifying, terrifying sight. And again, this sort of process, right, of dispossession, displacement that we've been seeing, you know, throughout the West Bank, and obviously was the whole modus operandi in Gaza. I don't want to spend too much time on Lebanon, but just to note that, you know, we've been discussing the US's push to shut down UNIFIL, the United Nations interim force in Lebanon, whose mandate is supposed to be up next year. And in the meantime, the Israeli army is dropping grenades on UN peacekeeping troops in Lebanon, just openly. With, again, no consequences, because this is the new world order that they have established. At the same time, of course, also continuing to do these weekly, if not daily, strikes on Lebanese people in the south of Lebanon and sometimes as far up as Beirut. During all of this, of course, is this ongoing fever pitch conversation about how the Lebanese government needs to be doing more to disarm Hezbollah, despite the fact that Lebanese territorial sovereignty is being violated basically on a daily basis. In the United Nations, folks probably saw some news about Trump or the Trump administration canceling all of the visas for the entire Palestinian delegation to come to the UN this week. They started meeting on Tuesday, so that has already begun. There was some news that I'm pretty sure was fake news about the UN like sanctioning the United States or Israel or moving the meeting, and all of that I think was just a bunch of hot air. No one was actually going to do anything, unfortunately. But it's worth noting again that these are not like the Hamas delegation. This is the Palestinian Authority, who are the enemies of Hamas and the allies of the United States government, who nevertheless are being refused entry into the US. And if you wanted even more evidence that this is pure political theater, it's only the people who were meant to go speak at the UN who were denied entry. The head of Palestinian, like the head of intelligence for the Palestinian Authority, who works very closely with Israelis, obviously arresting anyone who poses a threat to the status quo, was in fact given a visa this week and has come to the United States to meet with security and intelligence officials in DC. So that part is totally fine. They're still collaborating and doing security work with the PA. They all continue to be friends, despite the fact that both the PA and the US government like to talk about the other as the enemy. They're actually 100% in the same camp here. It's also worth noting that like for all the outcry about not letting the Palestinian delegation come to the UN and the rest of the UN members, feeling very compelled to sort of respond to that, the response was largely a broad commitment, or I would say recommitment from United Nations member states for the two-state solution, which like what a useless response to this moment of like an inconceivable outcome that's totally divorced from the actual realities on the ground at this point. That doesn't do any sort of justice to like what Palestinians have been experiencing, obviously, and it's just this like tired talking point that means nothing at all. So really, frankly, disappointing response by the UN, which is just resorting to like talking points that were stale 20 years ago. Folks also probably saw in this like continuing theme of attacks on other countries with total impunity. There have been 2 now drone bombings of the Samud flotilla that is on its way to Gaza. The last happening just a couple of days ago near Tunisia, where a drone attacked one of the boats on the flotilla. This is the second attack, I believe. It may have been a grenade, as far as I've heard, but I don't know all the details, unfortunately. But what we are seeing in relation to the flotilla is some really remarkable solidarity by dock workers around the world, who are all saying, like, if the flotilla isn't allowed to continue its mission, we're also shutting down this port. So like, this sort of global solidarity movement that we've been trying to build for all of this time is materializing in these really incredible ways. And so Italy, Spain, a series of other places have all committed to shutting down their ports in solidarity with the Samud flotilla if anything happens to them on their way. And every now and again, I think people reach out also being like, okay, well, let's get the Oakland port shut down in solidarity, which like, yeah, I'm not opposed to that. And the way we do that is through dock workers, right? That's the key word here in this article, European dock worker unions. So that's a conversation that needs to happen with the local longshore union, which is so down for Palestine. But a reminder to look out for our union brethren in their struggles as well, as we sort of think about how we do this, like in a way that's consistent with our broader left values. In the context of all of this, of course, there's been some massive BDS wins in the past couple of weeks, given the sort of tenor of discourse around the horrors of what Israel is doing and this rapid shift in public opinion. When I first saw this story, it was 1,200 film industry figures pledged not to work with Israeli institutions. A few days after that story come out, that number went from 1,200 to 4,000. A lot of really, really famous people in Hollywood now refusing to work with Israeli institutions. Huge deal, given Hollywood not exactly known as a bastion for pro-Palestinian sentiment. Um, so a really, really big BDS win there. And additionally, as much as I hate Eurovision generally, sorry, um, amazing news that Ireland, Spain, Slovenia, and Iceland all saying that they won't participate in Eurovision if Israel is allowed to participate. So again, really big BDS wins here in terms of isolation and pariah statehood for the Israeli state. And in the context of this like growing, massively growing resentment against Israel and this push for anti-Zionism and the end of US support for the genocide, we are seeing the typical state responses, right? Both the hard response and the soft response. I think the clearest example of the hard response that we saw this week was in London, where 400 protesters were arrested for literally doing nothing other than condemning genocide and supporting Palestine action. The videos of these arrests are absolutely wild if you have not seen them. It's literally a bunch of like sweet octogenarians, including a bunch of Holocaust survivors, being dragged off by armored police just for saying like, not in my name, don't do this, Absolutely heartbreaking stuff. And a reminder that like for all the discursive shift we're hearing from the Labour government in the UK about being really horrified by Israel, what Israel is doing, in terms of where actions are taking place, obviously, the only people suffering consequences are those who are opposing the genocide. In terms of the soft touch, I would say nothing is clearer for that, for me in this moment than this long drawn out fight that has been happening over AB 715, the so-called anti-Semitism bill that has been bouncing around in the state legislature basically this entire year. The arc and story of AB 715 is long, but the short version is that backed by the Legislative Jewish Caucus, a bill was introduced that was supposed to gut ethnic studies, right? And basically shut down any inclusion of like Palestine stuff or any criticism of Israel that might be in any ethnic studies curricula. That was so widely opposed and so vociferously opposed by such a broad group of people that at the very last minute, the authors of the bill did what's called a gut and amend. Basically, they took a different bill that was about nothing related to anything about this, removed all of the language from it, and replaced that language with a bunch of stuff about combating anti-Semitism in public schools generally, which like, great, that's actually an important and really valuable thing to do. We should be prioritizing combating anti-Semitism in anywhere. But unsurprisingly to anyone, I suppose, the language of that bill basically gets into the idea that that Israelis in California are feeling unsafe, and goes into a series of examples about how schools and educators would be held liable for content that this bill deems to be anti-Semitic, and then went through a range of iterations and amendments that really sort of showed the face of what this bill was, at some point including a list of examples of what would be anti-Semitic, and it included things like, and this is not an aberration, like they were all like this, included things like calling Israel a settler colonial state, which is just a observable fact, but nevertheless somehow that's just inherently anti-Semitic. This bill is so noxious that not only is it obviously opposed by everyone in the sort of civil liberty space, the Palestine solidarity communities, the ethnic studies folks, it was opposed by all the major teachers unions and the school board associations, which literally never agree on anything, right? It's basically impossible that the school boards and the teachers unions are on the same side, but they're both against this bill. And so because of all of this pressure, basically the bill had to be taken back and like rewritten and amended and amended and amended, to the point where I think a lot of folks were like, okay, well, this bill's got to be dead because the California legislature closes on September 12th. It's the last day of the legislature before they close out for the term. And as of last week, there was no language whatsoever. And then, a hearing needs to be scheduled 3 days in advance, and then there needs to be like, a series of discussions and opportunities for public consultation. And so, given the time it would take to do that, it was impossible for this bill to pass. But surprise, surprise, just this week, basically, they decided to reintroduce an amended version of the bill. It is just as bad as it ever was. They rammed it through by getting a series of special waivers that skipped the public consultation process, skipped the notification periods, skipped a series of committees that it's supposed to be heard in, including, for example, it should have gone through the Judicial Committee, given that this bill is very likely to result in a series of lawsuits about the constitutionality of, again, punishing schools for saying Israel is a settler colonial state. Skipped all those committees altogether. A bill so noxious that, like, even in the committees that it did go through, I watched the Education Committee hearings a couple days ago, where all of the state senators present in that committee were like, oh yeah, this bill is hugely problematic. It's got so, like, it's clearly very controversial given that, most of the people here showed up to oppose it. It's opposed by the teachers' unions and all these other people. It's clearly not thought out in terms of its consequences. So we'll fix it later. We'll fix it in post, basically, right? Like, I'm still going to vote for it, and then we'll later pass another bill to fix the problems with this bill. We'll do that in the next session, no big deal. And so, like, the amount of pressure clearly being put on these members of the legislature to get this bill through, despite the fact that their constituents hate it, the main unions hate it, the overwhelming majority of all Californians are against this kind of thing. And obviously, it's just massively chilling on free speech in a time where, like, you're basically protecting the perpetrators of a genocide. Really speaks to the continuing power, I would say, of pro-Zionist forces within political systems. And so, as of a few days ago, it was looking very likely that AB 715 was going to pass. It did pass through the Senate entirely, sailed through. It's supposed to take at least a week to get through the Senate. They passed it all the way through in under 48 hours. And now, on the final day of the legislature, it's back in the House, and we're seeing, based on the testimony that's happening right now, I really strongly recommend when you get off the PSA, go check out the live stream of what's happening in the Assembly. Assembly members are furious about how this has happened, and they're actually responding, I think, to the fact that they've been getting thousands upon thousands of emails and calls from their constituents telling them to oppose this bill. And the public pressure is strong enough that it's actually breaking through what once was just a total stranglehold, right, of these legislative bodies that are so beholden to the Zionist lobby forces. And you can see, like, the list of organizations that oppose this bill is so wide and so broad, and then the list that supports it is literally just Zionist institutions. That's it. There's one, like, Hindu nationalist organization in there too. And aside from that one, they're all, like, explicitly Zionist organizations. And so the fact that this is actually cutting through, this is a screenshot from the bill today. You can see the authors being harangued by the Assembly, looking really unhappy because they thought this was in the bag. And it's not. It's incredibly not in the bag, despite the fact that it looked like it was gonna be. I really can't overstate the importance of this moment to not only send an email. I do think that that's really critical to let people know what you think, but also to make calls, right? Particularly given that it's happening right now, those calls are absolutely critical. And all of that is happening, you can access it on bit.ly/AB715. I am going to get everyone I know to do this multiple times, and for anyone who's already filled it out, I'm going to tell them fill it out again and call again. And yeah, I can't tell you what to do, but I'm telling you that that's how I'm going to spend the next hour of my time, because it's really hard to overstate what a massive difference this makes in terms of the political orientation of how the California political ecosystem understands, like, how it relates to Zionism and pro-Palestine solidarity. Consider, for example, that this bill will then be going to Gavin Newsom, right, who is watching all of this given his, like, presidential bids and all of that. So This can really change the tenor of how people understand what's happening in terms of this moment, this political moment in California specifically. So really hard to overstate that. I always like to close out with a little bit of polling. Some fascinating polling I saw this week coming out of New York, showing that APAC has a negative 40% favorability rating, while JVP has a plus 30 net favorability rating. Just goes to show the extent to which the tides have massively changed here. And then, like, I really love this question. You know, they were like, okay, if you're going to vote in a Democratic primary election, if the person was endorsed by Hakeem Jeffries, would it impact your vote? And people were like, no. And they're like, okay, if he was endorsed by Zoran Mamdani, would it impact your vote? And people were overwhelmingly like, yes, absolutely. Like 60% of people said it would make them more likely to vote, which incredible numbers. And again, just goes to show that the Hakeem Jeffries, who still refuses to endorse Zoran Mamdani, is like deeply underwater, while the person that he's scared of endorsing is actually riding on this wave of popular support. And again, what a moment, what a shift. And I really want us to take advantage of that moment while we can, you know? And so, yeah, just to close out with a quick summary, the Gaza City attack is still ramping up. It's still not clear when that ground invasion is happening, and it's still incumbent on all of us to do whatever we can to slow it or stop it as much as possible. The cost in human life is unimaginable. So whatever pressure can be put on getting people to support, block the bombs and other things, I think is really critical in this moment. The ceasefire negotiations are really effectively over at this point. Well, they were already effectively over, now they're officially over, which, you know, opens the question, right, of like, what's the end game now and what are we pushing for? Because for a long time, what we were pushing for was ceasefire. And if we're not pushing for ceasefire anymore, I think it's very clear that where our leverage lies and the way that this war ends is cutting off weapons. There's really no other solution at this point. And so all our pressure into an arms embargo is really the thing, I think, in this moment for us to really take on. And then obviously, as that also relates to changing underlying, you know, the people who hold the levers to be able to do that are watching what is happening at the local level to figure out how it's going to impact them at the national level. And so starting locally is an absolutely key step here. So really encourage folks to get involved in California level things, because they really do have more of an impact than we think. And if you want to hear about events happening this coming week, please check out the AROC calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events. If you want text alerts, including updates on what's happening in Sacramento, please text PSA to 833-633-0604 and check out the PAL Media Tracker for articles that inform this analysis. You can sign up for a weekly digest at palmediatracker.com/signup. Some people have told me that their weekly digest is showing up in spam. So please check to see if it's there if you haven't been getting it lately, and please mark it as not spam. You know, people are, I think, purposely signing up and then flagging it to keep people from getting it. So let's try to undo that as much as we possibly can. And I said I was going to be short, but I yapped through the entire hour. But lovely to be here with you all, as always. Thank you so much.
Sammer, thanks. Thanks for making it really clear the urgency of what's going on right now with ABC. Was it 10-7 what is it? AB 715? Is that it?
That's right. Yeah, AB
Yeah.
715. Yeah.
Every 715, yeah. And folks know what to do. This is definitely a convergence of the fight against fascism and the fight against the repression of speech and the fight for Palestine. So thanks for spelling that out. We will be a couple announcements before we go. We will be doing another Fighting Fascism series in a couple of weeks, so you can sign up for the next one, which is going to be addressing a little bit of the ICE raids that happened in Los Angeles and this notion of how we defend against militarized occupation in communities and attacks on migrant communities who are on the front line with Detention Watch Network, Trabajadores Unidos, Workers United, and we have some amazing organizers speaking on that.